Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're just going to wait about a minute or two until everyone is able to join us and get settled. Going to give one more minute as we see our participants still joining us. Again, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us. We will be starting shortly. All right, well, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Inaudi Esposito. We are so happy to be hosting this really important conversation today. I am the Executive Director for the Orange County Human Rights Commission, and I use the pronouns she, her, and ella. The mission of the Orange County Human Rights Commission is to work towards bringing people together and provide education and awareness around issues affecting oppressed communities, especially during these times where our country is in turmoil over social injustices. The Commission is committed to continue to bring attention to issues like anti-Semitism and help provide resources and tools for healing and action. Today is actually part 2 of our conversation on building understanding anti-Semitism and Kyrias Joel, and it is a partnership between the Human Rights Commission and the Jewish Federation of the Greater Orange County. And moderating with me today is Rabbi Rachel Rubenstein, Executive Director of the Jewish Federation. Rabbi Rachel, would you please introduce yourself and our guest today?
Thank you, Inaudi. As I was so kindly introduced, my name is Rabbi Rachel Rubenstein. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Orange County. And the mission of the Jewish Federation is really to support and enable a strong and secure Jewish community in Orange County, in Israel, and around the world. And as part of that work, we have created the Zachor Anti-Semitism Initiative. And that initiative really works with our partners, such as the Orange County Human Rights Commission, with other local governments, with our public schools, and with our community partners to educate our community on issues surrounding anti-Semitism and all kinds of hatred and bigotry. Our mission is to really create and support an Orange County that is free of all hatred and bigotry. And so it is really my pleasure to be co-sponsoring this with our wonderful partners at the Orange County Human Rights Commission. And it's truly an honor to be able to introduce our guest panelist, Julie Golding. Julie is a curator at the Holocaust Museum and Center for Tolerance and Education, which is located in Rockland County and serves Rockland County, Orange County, and parts of New Jersey as well. And it's really an amazing institution that has a mission of educating on the Holocaust and also on anti-Semitism more generally, and working through education to create a more tolerant and a more understanding place. And so it is really my pleasure to welcome an expert in the field, Julie Golding, to work with us today. I think we all know that this is a timely seminar, as unfortunately it always is, and I hope that we will be able to address as many of your questions as possible. As you can see on the screen, if you do have a question, please utilize the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your screen. Please note that participants are muted and have no video, so Q&A is really the way to communicate if you have a question, or if you're having any technical difficulties, or if you need to communicate for any reason with myself or with our panelists. That is the way to do so. So I want to introduce our panel today by explaining a little bit about what our mission is today. You know, anti-Semitism is a large issue. We're not going to be able to cover everything about anti-Semitism from its history to today. Our mission is really to focus on the Orange County community, on us locally, how we experience anti-Semitism in our community, and what each of us as individuals can do to stand up against it. And something that we really wanted to bring attention to is this idea of a dog whistle. So oftentimes I, as the director of the Jewish Federation, see on social media, for instance, people saying things like, "I'm not anti-Semitic, but," and then they continue their sentence. And I believe that a lot of people in our community truly do believe that they are not anti-Semitic and are not anti-Semitic. You know, people have good intentions a lot of the time. But oftentimes when people are making statements and making generalizations about communities, they use things that are called dog whistles. And we have here a definition of what a dog whistle is. This is from Vox.com, and it says, "A dog whistle is a political shorthand for a phrase that may sound innocuous to some people, but which also communicates something more insidious, either to a subset of the audience or outside of the audience's conscious awareness, a covert appeal to some noxious set of views." So what that means in plainer English is that sometimes people say things that to a broad audience may seem innocuous, may seem like there's no undertones to what they're saying, but to a subset of people, in this case, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, to a certain group of Jewish people who have an understanding of Jewish history and of anti-Semitism, they hear all of the anti-Semitic undertones that come from our history. And so with that, I really do want to turn it over to Julie, who will be able to educate all of us on so much of the history of anti-Semitism and where it stands today.
Okay, thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Reverend Rachel and Inaudi, for having me here today. It's really a very special opportunity to be able to speak to your community. Hoping to speak during good times, but definitely at any time that we're invited to speak, we love to take the opportunity on behalf of the museum to educate and to speak out about our mission, which is promoting tolerance and fighting anti-Semitism. So we were going to start today just by talking a little bit about where we see anti-Semitism and what it's looking like very specifically in Orange County today. It's been an interesting week specifically, and we've really, as we started planning this event, it looked a little different than it actually looks today. So we're not going to talk about very specifics at the exact moment, but we're going to try to go through some of the things that we're seeing today, especially in relationship to COVID-19 and how that's playing out with the general Jewish community. So very often, unfortunately, during a time of a war or a famine or a plague, people will be looking to scapegoat or to place the blame for their problems on someone else. And as we've seen throughout history, many times the Jews have been scapegoated for these type of problems. During the bubonic plague, which took place in the 1300s, Jews were scapegoated. They were blamed for causing, they were blamed for causing the plague, which we actually know was caused by the rats. However, the Jews were blamed for poisoning the local wells and for poisoning the community. And we have here a very powerful image of Jews who are being burned because they were blamed for causing this terrible disease that ravaged Europe. If we bring us to the next slide, if we can take us to the next slide, thank you. So we've seen this throughout many different times when a disease has come about. Jews very often get blamed either for causing it, and then a number of different phenomena appear. And we're going to go through here a couple of the different phenomena that we see, the specific themes and trends that we're seeing today that are really nothing new, that have appeared so many times, whether it was in the Holocaust or through earlier anti-Semitic periods. So here we actually see something. If you take a look at the right-hand side, this is something that was pulled recently from social media, which is taking a look, and people have been actually blaming the Jews as causing the virus or looking like the virus. Now, again, not a new concept, not anything new that we're seeing. And if you take a look at the images on the left-hand side of the screen, these are images pulled from the Holocaust period. These are anti-Semitic propaganda from the 1930s. And you can actually see these pieces of propaganda, these advertisements, where Jews, this one on the bottom over here, which is in French, talks about tuberculosis, syphilis, cancer that are curable, but the biggest problem of all is the Jews. And behind it, you can see when we look at the caricature of the Jew, that is taken from the film The Eternal Jew, where you see kind of that very Jewish look, what Jews were portrayed as having that large hook nose, as having dark curly hair. And this is imagery that's been repeating itself throughout history, and we're seeing it again in this 2020 piece of propaganda about the Jews, blaming the Jews for the virus. We take a look at the next slide. So today we're seeing a tremendous increase in conspiracy theories. It has to do with the political climate. It has to do with COVID-19. It has to do with a number of different things going on today. And I'm sure you're all nodding your heads out there saying, yes, we're seeing an increase in conspiracy theories, talks about conspiracy theories. And whenever there's an increase in conspiracy theories, we're going to see an increase in conspiracy theories about the Jews. And sure enough, one of the most famous conspiracy theories is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a fictitious book written in 1903 in Russia, which was proven false. However, it spoke about the Jews who were sitting around and had a plan to rule the world. And it was translated into many languages. Until today, you can buy copies of it. Until today, people speak about it. And I know we've heard even in recent years from politicians in the US who speak about Jews controlling the banks, controlling the weather, controlling so many different things. And a lot of this does go back to the protocols. And today with the coronavirus, we're seeing, again, more conspiracy theories of Jews looking to control the world. Here we have a piece of propaganda, which is showing, again, the Jew, which is, this is actually a picture of what's known as the lucky Jew, the lucky merchant, which you can see the little man, the little rabbi holding his hands together, rubbing them in a greedy way, holding a vaccine, trying to insinuate that somehow the Jews have created a vaccine and are going to profit from that vaccine. So again, this is a whole conspiracy that this whole virus was caused by the Jews so that they can profit from it and somehow control the world and make a lot of money. If we take a look at the next slide, something we see time and time again is a promotion of Holocaust denial. How we go from coronavirus to Holocaust denial is definitely a stretch, but if you take a look, once we're talking about numbers of deaths and we're talking about what's going on and how people are dying and terrible tragedy, and then somehow people want to start bringing up conspiracy theories. And again, anyone who's looking for a place, has an agenda of Holocaust denial, has found the ability to speak about it on social media. And what's very scary about social media is that it gives every person who's sitting in the privacy of their home a platform to speak about whatever ideas they want to speak about. So while in previous years, someone would have needed an entire rally to try to get across a point or to bring out an idea, here all it takes is a keyboard or a phone sitting in a home, and suddenly these voices are amplified in a way where they can say anything that is completely untruthful, and everybody can hear it, and they can cause tremendous problems because of it. So another really, really difficult subject that we need to talk about is how individuals are using the coronavirus as a call to harm Jewish communities. So anti-Semitism is really, really fascinating phenomenon in that it takes root and it takes shape in so many different communities in so many different ways. And we know throughout history that even when there have been places in the world where Jews did not live for hundreds of years, anti-Semitism existed. Literature was written about Jews. Jokes have been made about Jews. Anti-Semitism has flourished in different ways based on the culture and the timing of what's going on. So right now today, it's not even surprising that we're seeing people saying, oh, if you have the coronavirus, go and harm your local Jewish community. Now we're seeing calls to other communities as well, but again, it's taking this idea and it's spinning it in a specific way that is causing extra additional hatred. As I said, in a way that's actually a little unexpected for scholars and historians who are looking at this. So what we wanted to branch into now, now that we've touched on some general ideas of anti-Semitism, is what's going on right now in Orange County in the specific Orthodox, Haredi, Hasidic communities. And this is an image taken from Governor Cuomo's press conference earlier this week. And there's been a lot of frustration and a lot of speaking out about what's going on, zones that have been drawn to try to show where hotspots are, shutting down of schools, shutting down of synagogues, a lot of discussion whether or not synagogues are being singled out, are they not being singled out? And we didn't want to use this platform to discuss the legitimacy of different political statements that have been made. But what's important to take a look at on this image is the photographs that were selected for use during this press conference. And these pictures were up for quite some time, and they were pointed out to be images that were taken over the last couple of weeks in Hasidic, Haredi Orthodox communities. The problem is that image on the left over there is actually an image taken in 2007 at the funeral of the Satmar Rebbe, actually here in Orange County. So the problem with this image is that it's not accurate. And what we need to speak out about, what we need to take a look at is make sure that we're using accurate information, not inciting anti-Semitism or violence or hatred in any way that is not and not doing anything that's not truthful that will cause additional hatred. So the use of this image is particularly scary if we're trying to tone down the rhetoric and we're trying to take a look and understand what's really going on out there. So a lot of the questions that have been coming out about the Orthodox community has been, why aren't they social distancing? People are going into a supermarket or they're going down the street and they feel like they see people in their community who are not social distancing, who are not wearing masks. And they were like, what's going on? And this is causing, as we'll see in a little bit, social media to really explode with comments about this. And we are fielding questions in our various roles here in the county. So just to go through a couple of reasons why people might look like people are not social distancing. So first of all, it's really important to understand how communal the Orthodox Haredi lifestyle is. For an Orthodox Jew, going to synagogue, being with your family, attending school is the utmost priority. Learning Torah, and attending synagogue for prayers is considered of utmost importance. And for a community to stop functioning around these major community centers is incredibly difficult. So we have to recognize how these communities are built, unlike some other communities, but like many other insular communities that we do see in the United States and around the world, to recognize how important this is and how difficult it could be for such communities to social distance or to separate from one another. There's also, if we skip to number 3, you'll see a lot of high density housing. Now we're seeing a lot of coronavirus hotspots that are breaking out in high density housing areas. Yes, in the Orthodox communities, and yes, in many other places as well. So while the question is if these communities do need to be singled out or not, but to recognize that people who live in high density housing are going to be closer to one another by virtue of the fact that they live right near each other. So it's important to really take a look again at how these communities are structured. Regarding herd immunity, when the information first came out in March, when the virus first broke out earlier this year, a lot of the Orthodox communities were hit very hard because it was specifically around the holiday of Purim, and because of other reasons. And there's actually an idea in the community that so many people have had the virus that there's some sort of herd immunity going on within the community, and many people feel that they are actually immune to the virus as well. So sometimes you'll see people who are not keeping social distance from one another because they've already had the virus. And being that I'm not a medical professional who can speak to whether or not you can have it again, I can't speak to that, but there's definitely this thought process, and it's important to recognize that. Following on that idea is that within this community, there's some communities, especially Yiddish-speaking communities, are having more limited access to outside news sources. As we know, many people do not have internet in their homes. Many of them do not carry smartphones. They're not sitting on social media. They're not sitting on the news in the same way that others in the area are doing so. And in thinking about this, it's also important to understand how that news and information is being disseminated from the government. I know recently there's been a lot of talk about the number of contact tracers that New York has hired, and I think they've hired 20-something contact tracers, and it's come out that only one of them are actually Yiddish speaking. So if the governments are actually looking to provide information and that people should have access to the information, we need to make sure that information is going out there in a way that the communities can access it and can understand it. And the contact tracers are speaking many different languages. So in the same way that this information is being put out there in Spanish and in Creole and in so many different languages, is it being put out there in Yiddish? Is it being put out there in Hebrew for people who speak those languages? Another really important thing to understand is how the communities are responding to government shutdowns of synagogues, of schools, of community institutions. And you're talking about community, you're talking about individuals, families that for many of them have a tremendous mistrust of the government, tremendous mistrust of governments in general, not specifically the US government, but governments in general. A lot of it stemming from what they went through in the Holocaust and through other anti-Semitic periods throughout history. There is an inherited trauma from within these communities. And the idea that if somebody comes along and says, you need to close your synagogue, to say, we're not closing that synagogue. That's not something we want to do. And we're gonna fight back, we're gonna push back at any cost. And if we really, which is why talking about trying to fight anti-Semitism really begins with education. We need to understand what they've been through and why they're responding in the way that they are. And the last one, I actually wanted to share a personal story. It's not something I do very often in these kind of forums, but we need to think about judging some people favorably. I can tell you a personal story that in the beginning of March, I was with my family. I was outside on my front yard, And I had been extremely careful with social distancing. Everybody knows I was really careful because I had a new baby that was born in March. And I was very, very careful because of the new baby. And I really did not want to contract the virus and bring that home with a newborn in the house. And I was standing outside. It was Friday night. And I was standing outside with my 6 children. And we were standing on our front lawn. And my neighbor was standing across the road with her 6 children. And my neighbor next door to me was standing there with her 5 children. And you can imagine what the picture looked like, that we had these large families standing on our individual lawns, and we were all being very careful. And at that moment, a woman walked by and said very loudly, she was taking a very brisk walk, and said loudly into her phone, "Oh, look, they are not social distancing." And it was really, it was a pretty awful moment because we had been so careful. As I said, I could even explain to you like how super extra careful I was, like wiping down. I was Lysoling the packages that came in the door after leaving them outside for 2 days straight. So we were so careful. And then for somebody to say they, to be called they, and to be referred to as, those people who are not doing it, was like, it was just such blatant anti-Semitism, and being called out for something that we weren't doing. It was an awful feeling. And I can tell you that when we look around, that if perhaps you're looking around and you're seeing these families that have 10, 13 children will look like they're not social distancing. They're standing with their families. Perhaps they're potting with another family. So you really have to take a good look and judge favorably, judge kindly at the community before you start speaking up and engaging and speaking out about things. So if you take a look at the next slide, I just wanted to point out, these are actually images that were taken, pictures that were taken in the last couple of days locally here in Muncie. And you have, it's important to recognize that people in the community, many people are actually being very careful about wearing masks, whether it's because of health concerns, whether it's because of a concern about closing businesses, in the same way that people across America have lost livelihoods. People in the Orthodox communities have lost their livelihoods. People have lost family members. There's been tremendous, tremendous loss in this community on very personal levels, on communal levels, financial levels, and people really there are many people doing it, which is why I want to talk about the next slides, about some of the problems we're seeing specifically in the Orthodox community. So we're looking at this generalized blame. So as I just mentioned before, there are so many individuals who are being careful, but then we're taking, very often when it comes to the Jewish community, we look at the actions of a few, and then they get generalized to the community at large. So we're seeing all across social media, somebody sees someone not wearing a mask or not social distancing, and then suddenly they're generalizing that to the community, speaking out and inciting hatred and inflammatory rhetoric. It's incredibly scary to see what we're seeing, or suggesting that if something happened in one city or you read about it in the news, that it's going to happen in all the Haredi communities. All over the place. So we're seeing a lot of generalized blame when in fact, we really have to look at the actions of individuals, and it's really important for that to happen. Another action that we're seeing is a lot of stereotyping. These are posts that were just pulled this morning from Facebook about what the Orthodox communities are like, suggesting that they're spreading disease, that they're living in, because they're living in crowded areas, they're spreading the virus, that they're somehow dirty, that people are disregarding rules and laws. And I mean, this kind of language, referring to Jews as parasites. Think back to those earlier slides of the Jew being looked at as the virus. And again, something we saw during the Black Plague in the 1300s, something we saw in the 1930s in Germany, and we're seeing in 2020 again today in America, as referring and stereotyping Jews as a disease itself and as a parasite. Some other things we're seeing is calls for use of violence, to use legal rights to keep Orthodox Jews, to keep Hasidim out of specific areas. I know there was an incident this week in Orange County. There's been a number of incidents lately, also here in Rockland County, about not allowing Jews to use parks, not allowing Orthodox Jews into local areas, suggesting that we should bring in the military, the National Guard. Again, these kind of calls is something that we're seeing very specifically about the Orthodox Haredi communities, and something that we're seeing really prominently here in Orange County and here locally in Rockland County. And it's just kind of every day we're just seeing more and more of this. Another thing that we're seeing is calls for isolation, punishment, and neglect. We're looking at calls for violence against these communities, to isolate these communities as though kind of isolating the community is going to have this, to lock down, drawing zones, drawing different areas, trying to deny people medical treatment, because again, we're taking the actions of individuals, generalizing it to the communities, and then calling for harm, calling to deprive them of basic human rights. Again, something we're seeing very, very much going on here in the county. And if we take a look at the next slide, again, we're bringing it back again to comments about the Holocaust. You kind of wonder, how did we get from here to the Holocaust? How do we get to Holocaust denial and Holocaust distortion? Not expected, unfortunately, not unexpected here. And these posts really, they need to be monitored. They are being monitored, and there are a number of organizations speaking out about it and what we need to do about it. So with that, I'm actually going to turn over to Anaudi here, who's going to speak a little bit about bias and how we can work to combat it.
Thank you so much, Julie, for all of that information. I'd love hearing you talk about it, because quite often, and in the times you and I have spoken and with Rabbi Rachel, we can compare stories of very similar things that have happened outside of the Hasidic community. You know, one example you gave in speaking of the herd immunity is that I too have had friends where I've had discussions where specifically one friend, her husband and her children had it. And then this was right before the summer. And then all of a sudden they're going to water parks and they're going to the beach, and, you know, they're making all these plans. And I'm like, why are you going? What's the issue? And she reminded me, oh, well, we've had it, so we can do these things. And there's this, you know, difference of the position where you are, because she's like, well, we've had it, so we can do these things. But nobody would question twice if they were to see her at this water park, right? Or her and her family. And you talked about, you know, you and your neighbor or your sister with her children. And, you know, we had our pod, right? And it was my neighbor with her 3 kids. And when it was me and my children and we were outside, nobody questioned us of not social distancing or made any comments about, look, they are not social distancing, because we are not Hasidic, right? So one of the things I wanted to talk about is bias, and where do these thoughts come from, right? We've talked about stereotype, we've talked about prejudices, but one of the things that's really important to talk about is the fact that we all have biases, right? Every single human being has bias. I mean, in essence, bias, right, is important because they're helpful for survival. They're helpful to help us make decisions. And they're very helpful for, you know, our brains to be able to categorize information as it's coming, because we receive so much of it. But today we want to spend just a few minutes talking about specifically implicit bias, right? So explicit bias is an individual who's aware of their prejudices and attitudes towards certain groups, right? Whether it's positive or negative. But when we talk about implicit, or also known as unconscious bias, we're talking about those attitudes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious way, right? So we may not necessarily realize that what we're doing or how we're speaking or our decisions or thoughts are actually, you know, kind of tinted by this bias. It does not necessarily align with our declared beliefs, right? And it doesn't even necessarily reflect stances that we would explicitly endorse or talk about. So those things are really important to keep in mind. The hopeful thing is that implicit bias is malleable, right? Our brains are incredibly complex and are flexible. So the same way we can unlearn things that we understand to be wrong after years, or the same way we can be flexible around new language because language changes, right? The same thing works with implicit bias. We just have to be able to say, okay, let me identify it so that can I have the next slide? I went to hit my enter, forgetting that I'm not sharing screen, Rachel. So this is just a quick video to kind of get us started into implicit bias. Rachel, it sounds like you may want to pause it. It sounds like we don't have the sound. When you shared screen, make sure you are sharing with sound. Thank you. Thank you. There you go.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes the shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an overrepresentation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Thank you, Rachel. Next slide, please. So, that video really introduces a few different things. I love the idea of the peanut butter and jelly, right? And if we look at it in the context of the conversation that we're having tonight, we can really consider if you were to open up your social media or your local news and you see a picture of a Hasidic community or a Hasidic group, what do we immediately go to, right? What are our first immediate thoughts? And it's the peanut butter and jelly effect. It also opens up the conversation and understanding that there are a lot of different types of biases. I'm only going to focus on 3 because I want to make sure that we get time for Q&A. But just really quick, some of the other ones include things like beauty bias, which is when you judge people based on how they look. You automatically make an assumption that they must be good, that they have good characteristics because they are, what we would consider societally beautiful. Affinity bias, we will actually talk about. There is something called the Horns effect and the halo effect, which are both the opposite. So the horns effect is when you make negative assumptions about someone, and then that will automatically cloud your judgment going forward. And the halo effect is when you have perceived someone to be positive based off of one trait, and that will automatically, kind of judge or fog. I like the idea of the mental fog, the way you see that person going forward. Another one is confirmation, which is where you're searching for evidence to back up those first impressions. Attribution bias, which is how we perceive the actions of others. So we will judge a person and make assumptions of them by something that they've done. So let's go on to the next slide.
And Nadia, I apologize. I have to stop the share for 1 second because
No
when I
problem.
share, people can no longer see you. So let me just share that
Oh,
again.
sure.
Everyone can. Okay, there we go.
Okay, and then conformity we're going to talk about. So let's just break down 3 of the biases that I think are some of the most common ones that we experience. So the first one is affinity bias, and it's the unconscious tendency to get along with people who are just like us, right? Think about work, think about, back when we were at school, who did we tend to sit with? Who did we tend to feel comfortable with? Who did we tend to go to? And that comes from an affinity bias because of our comfort level. It's much easier to socialize and spend time with people who aren't so different because you have something to talk about, right? And then it also requires more effort to bridge those differences when diversity is present. So it requires a little bit more work. It's a tendency to connect with people who share those similar interests, experiences, and backgrounds. And then, of course, we are more likely to favor people who have an affinity to us, right? Who are close to us, and we may not even be aware of how this is actually impacting us. One example that I like is picture yourself at a job interview, and the candidate opposing you is shifting in their seat. They're obviously nervous. You can see they're climbing up, they're breathing deeply, etc. For some reason, and again, because our brain functions so quickly, you may not realize why or how this is happening, but you feel some affinity for that person. And that will automatically make you more likely to smile or encourage them or try to put them at ease. And if you're the person doing the interview, it may even help you or make you kind of go softer on that person versus someone who, based on a different bias, we may look at and not have any connection with, and we may not have as much empathy towards that person right away because they don't share our affinities. A really good exercise that I like to share with folks and that I encourage people to kind of do on their own time is evaluating your own circle of trust. And you can easily Google the affinity bias exercise, but really what you're doing and what it asks you to do is to list the people who in your circle you have the highest trust of. And then we want you to go ahead, and if you see on the screen there, tell us their main identities, right? So break down, what gender are they, what race, ethnicity, are they foreign born, what age, their sexual orientation, disability, etc. And it kind of gives you a picture, and this is outside of your family, right? So these are the people that are really close to you outside of your family. It kind of will give you a picture of how diverse your own circle is, and then it'll help you consider where is your affinity bias, right? And what do you need to kind of welcome a little bit more of to be more challenged, to be more exposed to different things in diversity. Next slide, Rachel. Confirmation bias. It's the tendency of people to favor information that confirms already what they believe, right? So if you have a very strong belief, and this effect is really usually much stronger when it's around emotionally charged issues or issues around deeply entrenched beliefs, right? But it happens when a person gives more weight to the evidence that confirm what they already believe, and it undervalues any evidence that could disprove it. I think about what we're going through right now when it comes to politics and when it comes to, the debates, right? We've been talking about the debates because they're so recent. And it really is incredible if you were to talk to someone who is of your opposite party and you were to state what that one candidate said, right, of that other person's party, if you understood it one way, maybe you're shocked or appalled by it, And their perspective, because that candidate actually stands for their values and what they believe in, their perspective is completely different, right? And I found myself in this situation a few times where we are speaking of one very clear thing. You can Google, you can see the video, but what I interpreted is completely different than what this other person interpreted, and this other person happens to agree with that point of view. That comes from confirmation bias. It's an effect that just, unless we are willing to consider something outside of what we strongly believe in, we won't. We will just kind of stay strong to our heels. This type of bias is particularly problematic because it really, there's not a lot of room for a person's perspective to change based on evidence, right? Because they will still look at the evidence and say, well, where's that source from? And they may actually still consider, asking and questioning what this person is giving, even though there's some form of evidence, because it's not what they believe, right? And I think of, even a presentation like this, where I've heard people say, but what about this? But what about this? And we're like, oh, we're giving you facts. We're giving you perspectives that may have not been given somewhere else. But if you're really strong on your mindset, and it opposes what we're saying, then it's really hard to consider it unless you're willing to actually be open-minded. Rachel, did you want to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to hop in quickly with this confirmation bias. I just wanted to hop in with the issue we're discussing today. I saw, we'll have some time for questions at the end, but to bring it back to the issue of anti-Semitism and specifically in Orange County, I saw a lot when there was a period of months where the cases in Palmtree and Kyrias were lower, that a lot of people were questioning, well, they're probably just not getting tested, or they're probably just, they're deceiving the system. They're
not reporting the cases.
Exactly. They're doing something to make those numbers low. It's clear that because their reported cases have gone up, that seems to me not to have been true. But I think this is an example of confirmation bias, that, okay, you're being presented with data that their cases are low. You don't want to believe that data because you have a bias that you want to pursue. And so you're going to somehow explain to yourself why that data is not true. And I think that seems to me to be a example of this.
Perfect example. Thank you. Can you go to the next slide? Perfect. So another example of confirmation bias, it's, social media and where we get our news from. So the information we're reading, because it's similar to affinity bias, you look for things that you agree with, right? You look for things that you connect with. So we tend to read the news and follow social media groups that align with our perspectives. A really great example is if you're ever doing a search on something, and let's say, for example, you want to know are dogs better than cats, and you go Google it. So Google will actually respond to you with more likely that dogs are better than cats, with articles confirming that, because the question you're asking is, are dogs better than cats? Now, if you asked, are cats better than dogs, Google will respond to you with articles that prove, yes, cats are better than dogs, versus which animal is a better pet, right? So it's all about the perspective and how we see it. Next slide. So there's this really excellent tool, which is interesting, because part of confirmation bias is understanding where the tool comes from, and is also then asking questions. So even when you are given a tool that helps you break down, and this specific, it's called the media bias chart.com, if you want to go look it up. It's actually, I personally find it really helpful, because what it does is it breaks down all the media outlets, right? And this is actually specifically from 3 years ago, which means some things could have changed, that's for sure. But it breaks them down between political sides, right? So left and right. And then it tells us, which one is where. So the one I have for you pulled up actually has a lot even more information for you. It talks about mainstreams, skews liberal, skews conservative, hyper-partisan conservative, hyper-partisan liberal to liberal utter garbage, as they call it, or conspiracy theaters, or conservative utter garbage or conspiracy theories. And then it kind of breaks down. So just ask yourself, where am I getting my information? And if you're looking at this chart, is it in the middle? Is it leaning left? Is it leaning right? Where in this circle does it actually stand? Because it would be really helpful to know, are we getting information or are we getting opinions? And I think in the world of social media and fake news, it's a really important question to ask. The last one that we'll talk about is conformity bias, and that is the tendency people have to behave like those around us rather than using your own personal judgment. And that's something we see quite often on social media, where people, just start commenting based on, well, everybody agrees with this, or everybody obviously feels the same way, or this is, what the opinion is, so I'm going to go ahead and add to that as well. We will almost always push for homogenous consensus with a group to create harmony. It's a human response. And studies even show that people are more likely to act in a pro-social manner than they are to doing their own individual thing. With that said, unfortunately, it happens. We've seen it throughout history, and we continue to see it. And this video is actually a really great example of conformity bias.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
For a noon appointment.
Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes.
Great,
thanks so much.
Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University of Pennsylvania.
This sort of internalized form of herd behavior is part of what we call social learning. Starting at a very early age, when we see members of our group perform a task, our brains literally reward us for following in their footsteps.
When I saw everybody stand up, I felt like I needed to join them. Otherwise, I'm like excluded. Once I decided to go with it, then I felt much more comfortable.
Conformity is how we become socialized, but it can also cause us to develop bad habits or repeat past wrongs.
And it's why even this rebel, who wasn't standing for any of this nonsense, eventually joined the ranks. And the only thing more shocking than seeing how easily conformity affects the way you act is that similar forces are subconsciously shaping the way you think right now.
Thank you, Rachel. So just right before we break into Q&A, I just want to leave you with some ways that we can unlearn bias. It's important to keep in mind that our willingness to examine our own biases is a really important step to understanding the roots of stereotypes and prejudice in our society. That unless we, take a real deep look into our own biases and what we believe and what we've been taught and have always thought to be true, which are thoughts that will linger with us for life. But unless we tackle those things, we're not going to tackle these bigger issues of prejudice and stereotyping. So we have to learn to recognize and avoid generalizations. We have to counter stereotypes with positive images. It's about when that bias happens or when that immediate thought happens is actually taking and having a different thought to replace it. Practice individuation and understanding that we have to start individualizing. And instead of making these huge assumptions about an entire group, similar to Julie's story with the kids in the park, just actually consider that could be one family that's actually social distancing. And exposing ourselves to different things, putting ourselves in other shoes. So empathy, although can be difficult for many, we have to practice that much more often. And we have to force ourselves sometimes when our immediate thought is to be judgmental and have thoughts about, well, they're not social distancing, they're not wearing masks, they're spreading actually stop ourselves and actually ask questions. And then focus on concrete factors rather than our gut feelings, rather than the first thought that comes to mind, because of everything we're reading and everything we're exposed to. Thanks, Rachel. Ready for Q&A?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was just so phenomenal. And I hope that everyone in our audience knows that when we first started planning this conference, we may even have started planning before COVID. We knew what COVID
did. This was supposed to be a live 3-day thing.
And we because of the situation that we're living in right now, we shifted our focus to focus primarily on what the anti-Semitism we're seeing right now. But as I think Julie said, and can certainly expound upon, this happens to be the anti-Semitism we're seeing in this particular moment. But this is certainly not a COVID issue. This is an issue that we see in our communities. We have seen throughout history, and we have certainly seen in Orange County before COVID, and unfortunately after COVID, I'm sure we will see as well. And so that's really, I think, it is on each and every one of us to learn. And so I am so appreciative of Inaudi and of Julie and of the 50 plus participants who are on this call and are willing to take that step to learn. So I do appreciate that. We are just going to take a few minutes for Q&A. We don't want to keep people too long, but we are certainly open to doing more programs like this. I know Inaudi is as well, and we certainly are. And so if this is something that you want to see more of and have more questions of, we are certainly happy to have programs in the future. Julie, I want to address the first question to you. It's really, it's more of a factual question and a clarifying question that I think a lot of people want to know. Can you explain what the difference is between the terms Satmar, Haredi, Chassids? And I'll add to that question. I often hear people use the term incorrectly, Hasidics. So if you can just explain the verbiage and the term, that would be helpful.
Sure. So the term Haredi is kind of like an overarching term that refers to the Orthodox, anyone who falls within the Orthodox community. It's actually a Hebrew term, something that until a couple of years ago, I really only heard in Israel. But lately we've been seeing a lot of it. I see a lot of it in articles that are written, and I see a lot of people referring to the Haredi community here in America, which is quite interesting. Hasidic refers to a very specific religious group that stem from actually the disciples of a famous rabbi named the Baal Shem Tov, who was in the Ukraine. And then you see these very specific communities. They're generally centered around a rebbe, around a rabbi who leads that community. And there's a lot of leader and follower taking place within those communities. They'll generally be termed based on the area in Europe where they came from. So you asked about the Satmar community. Satmar actually stems from an area in the Ukraine, in Europe, where this specific group came from. The Satmar Rebbe came over to America, actually with, I think, about 10 disciples when he came over after the war. Virtually the entire Satmar community in Europe was wiped out during the Holocaust, and he was determined to rebuild. He, as probably most of you in the community are aware, selected an area outside of the metropolitan New York where he thought he could just rebuild a little Jewish community, a little shtetl, all over again, and really just keep to themselves. So you'll see Satmar. You'll see within the New York area many different groups. You'll see the Bubblers, you'll see the Belzers, you'll see smaller groups like Gerer or Kloisenberg and different areas like that. And these, again, they're stemming from different areas in Europe, and they're rebuilding their communities here in America based upon that. Did I capture all the terms that you asked me about?
Yes, and someone just wanted if you could do one sentence on people I've heard of Chabad and Lubavitch, if you can explain that as well.
Sure. So again, that's stemming again from another branch, another line of these students of the Baal Shem Tov. Each Hasidic group is going to have different customs, slightly different customs and variations. They'll wear slightly different dress. They'll have their own separate school systems for their children. They'll have their own synagogues. So Chabad is known to be a group that will go out there and try to help support Jews wherever they are in the world. So very often, if you're in a random city somewhere and you come across a Hasidic Jew, they're very often the local Chabad missionary who's out there supporting the Jewish community, trying to speak out and look out for any Jews who are there. They'll provide a kosher home and a place where people can come and have a Shabbat dinner and join around them. So they do have a central location in Crown Heights, but very often they're placed in many different cities around the world. And I see it as like a mission to go out there and do this.
Thank you so much. This next question, I think, really gets to the heart of what we're trying to discuss here, and I'm so happy it was asked. And I would love, Inaudi and Julie, for you both to take a stab at it. And it's really a question of how can I, as a bystander, respond when I see anti-Hasidic, anti-KJ, anti-Semitic things on social media?
Yeah, so the first thing is it's really hard to respond on social media. Because obviously, so many people who are not looking to address their biases or to address their own beliefs, they're not looking to engage in those conversations. But there's a few ways that someone can be a bystander when we talk about these issues. The first one is, and my favorite, is kind of asking a question. So when someone uses the terms they, them, or those people, right? Those people that, asking who are they? Right? What are we talking about? What do you mean by they? Oftentimes someone, the person using it will kind of be shocked with what do you mean? Who's they? You know who I'm talking about, but you're asking for clarification because you're showing, I don't want to just make the assumption, right? Also taking the time to attempt to inform people, right? And this sometimes is much easier when it's in person, when you're, at a family dinner or having a conversation with family members, where they're making a comment about, no, they don't social distance, they don't do this. Again, asking, well, how do we know that, or even saying some of the things that we've learned here today, consider, maybe the one group of people that you saw were social distancing or were their pod, maybe that was actually a pod. So it's almost helping them have the other narrative and not just the one narrative that they came in with, that one very biased, very strong narrative that is assuming you're going to agree with them. Sometimes it's kind of turning it and saying, well, maybe this, and leaving it there, because it really is challenging for a bystander to take someone on and kind of engage in when they're just so steadily stuck there. But when you pose it as a question or as a food for thought, it sometimes leaves room for actual thought and consideration.
I would add to that, really taking a look at your personal bias, your language, having genuine curiosity about other people around you, and first of all, just minding your own language. Like, would you say that around the dinner table, around your family? Would you say something like that? And then thinking about if that's something that should be said in a public forum. Are you modeling good behavior yourself by what you're saying and by what you're doing? And then not everybody is going to want to engage and to speak out, but if you are that person who's willing just to speak up, and as Naudi said, to ask questions or just to highlight one little point or to tell one positive story that you saw, you'd be amazed at what kind of a difference that can make. So even if you're not this big activist who wants to, make waves on social media, but those really, really small steps make a difference. And speaking positively when you see it and when you recognize it is crucial here.
Thank you. And another question we're hearing a lot is, what happens, we've learned a lot about that sometimes what we see is not necessarily true, what we hear, what we've been taught is not necessarily true. But what happens when we do have, we won't always agree with everything that another person does? What happens when we do have disagreements with the behavior of another person or another group of people? How do we discuss that without falling into some of these anti-Semitic stereotypes and tropes that we're seeing today?
So I think that one of the ways, and actually this answer can go for the last question as well, that we can combat, these specifically biases and thoughts and prejudices against one community is reminding people that we have similar issues in other communities too. I mean, someone mentioned in the chat box, people, walking around without masks on or walking around places they're not supposed to be, so they're breaking rules. People break rules from all communities, from all races, from all religions, from all. So it's actually posing the thought and the question of, so what's different from them breaking that rule than from them breaking that rule? Or, are we quick to point out the rule breakers, or who's, social distancing, who's not wearing masks, who's following the regulations? I mean, this summer, I lost count on how many Dunkin' Donuts, how many pizzerias I went to, where the people behind the counter weren't wearing masks or were wearing them under their nose, which is, might as well take the mask off. What's the point? So it's turning it around to remind people this actually does happen everywhere. And we shouldn't be focusing on just, because that's where it becomes anti-Semitic, right? There has to be an understanding of, we can and should be able to talk about real concerns of people, of groups, of communities when they are legitimate, right? Without crossing that line of those people, or without crossing that line of calling out someone's religion or someone's identity, to be able to talk about the concern that we have. And we have to evaluate, are we bringing up those concerns equally and fairly throughout the entire Orange County, throughout the entire community, or are we focusing at just one place?
I'm just going back to something, thank you, Nadia, because that was really well said. And going back to something that I said earlier about not generalizing, when you see an individual doing something, not to generalize that to the population. You can go over to somebody and say to them, would you mind wearing your mask? I'm very uncomfortable with what's going on here in public, with what's going on here. And I actually had an incident earlier in the summer. I recall I was in Walmart, and Walmart has very strict rules about wearing a mask. And I was standing there. I had taken my kids there actually for some back to school supplies. And I made sure to go in at a time when I knew it wasn't going to be busy. It was earlier in the morning on a weekday. And there was a family near me. It was a Jewish family, and they had taken off their masks. And as I said earlier, I wear my mask, and I'm very particular about it, especially with my new baby. And I turned to the person, I said, do you mind just wearing your mask, please, especially around my baby? And I was clearly one Orthodox Jewish person saying it to another Orthodox Jewish person, not looking to cast blame on an entire community, but it was the person who was standing closest to me. So not to generalize this to the entire community, but just to say, you can speak out, you can watch your language, watch how you say it, and to go over to somebody and say something or question them. And I think people are looking to be very genuine about this and to protect themselves and everybody else around them. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I know there are more questions, and I wish we had infinite amount of time. I think we'll close with this question to hopefully leave us with some hope moving forward. This person asks, seeing multiple examples of anti-Semitism here in Orange County now, and knowing that it has grown over the last several years, can make one feel overwhelmed and hopeless. Are there any examples of areas, or I guess of individuals, that have experienced sustained racist views that having changed, and how can we help that change? And I know, Julie, you have some experience with the museum and with educating folks who have had anti-Semitic views that you've helped to educate. And I would love if you would share one of those stories, and Einaudi, if you have a story to share as well.
Right. So at the museum, we do a lot of work on tolerance work and a lot of teaching about anti-Semitism. One of our missions is to go into the schools and to start teaching from a young age. And I think it's really important that we talk to our kids, that we talk to our students, and the same way negative thoughts begin as a small seed at this time, positive thoughts begin as well. And it's incredible to see programs that promote really just successful programs that have promoted positive feelings, positive actions, community building. We had a really, really incredible event at the museum last year where we had, I'll just speak briefly about this. I wasn't planning to, but where we had discovered in our archives a box of ashes from the Holocaust, where they had been brought over by a survivor. They ended up in the museum's archives, and we decided to bury them when we recognized what this issue was, and to bury them according to Jewish law. We used the moment as a teaching moment, and we did a lot of educational programs surrounding it. And if you would have seen the various groups, the various communities that came out from across the spectrum of Jews and from Jewish and from not Jewish, we got tremendous feedback from people who were using this moment as kind of like a point of humanity, basic decency. Let's provide these people with a final burial. And it was something that everybody could come around. It really spoke to the hearts of so many individuals. So these kind of programs are really important. And we do see people overcoming their bias, coming together in a room with people that they might have never come together with before, but because they feel so strongly about the same cause. And I think it's about finding those commonalities and finding, and as I said earlier, to be genuinely curious about people around you, because when you are genuinely curious, you will find more commonalities than you think.
Yeah. I think we're witnessing it, Rachel. I mean, you know, doing this work for over 15 years now, just about, there's plenty of times where it feels like, oh my gosh, right? And I've only been doing it for 15 years. Imagine the people who have been, you know, activists who have been fighting for this, for equality and equity for everyone, who've been fighting for rights for decades and decades. We have to hold on to the fact that we are now having this conversation on a different level. And if we've learned anything this year from different movements like the Black Lives Matter movements, is that people who were not talking about things like racism 6 months ago, all of a sudden are like, oh, wait a minute, we may have a problem, and are willing to say, I need information, I want to know more, right? That to me is a sign of hope. That to me is a sign of moving forward. You know, as a Human Rights Commission, we bring programs like these, and we have been for years. And every event, we have more and more people that say, I want more information. That to me is a sign of success. We're having a conversation about anti-Semitism, and this has been planned for months and months, and we talk about how timely it is. It's not our first conversation, right? But for many people on the call, they're like, oh, I had no idea, but that's okay, right? They'll show up to the next one. Or, you know, somebody just asked, how do I share this with my grandchildren and my children? This is all hope to me. This is all signs that we are and have been moving in the right direction. Will it take decades of continued work and grassroots movement and people like us speaking out and people like the folks listening who want to know, how do I be a good bystander? How do I be a good neighbor or a better person? That's what it takes. And we're all doing our part and the best that we can. And that's on different levels too, right? Not all of us have what it takes or the energy or the ability or, you know, the accessibility to take to the streets and protests, but you know, we learn and we read and we ask questions and we realize and that we need to befriend people that are different than us, or that we need to, you know, find these Zoom calls and these conferences and these things that are everywhere now, right? And watch them and podcasts and listen. And that most importantly, we need to address, what do we believe and what have we been taught, so that we can unlearn it. And that is all just very hopeful. So it's exciting. I think it's an exciting time to be alive and to do this work, because we're doing it.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both. I want to thank Inaudi and the Orange County Human Rights Commission. I want to thank Julie and the Holocaust Museum and Center for Tolerance and Education. And I want to thank everyone who serves on the Zahor Committee, who helped to plan this conference as well. We would love to hear from you. When you end your Zoom call, you should have a survey in your web browser. Please give us feedback. We would love to hear how you felt that these sessions went. If you have any comments or would like to learn about future offerings from the Orange County Human Rights Commission, Inaudi's email is on the screen and will also be in the survey. To learn more about future offerings from the Jewish Federation, you can email me. My information is on the screen as well. If you would like to get into contact with the Holocaust Museum and Center for Tolerance, you can also email me, and I'm happy to put you into contact with them. The recording from this session and from our first session are both available at jewishorangeny.org/antisemitism, and I believe they're also available on the county's YouTube page. So there are multiple ways to find that information.
We will also share it via email so that people can share it, because that was asked. So please, yes, absolutely share it as widely as you can.
Absolutely, please do. If you are a teacher who would like to receive CTLEs that were awarded from our partners at the Mid-Hudson Social Studies Council, I will be sending out an email that I'll have you respond to, and we will be in touch with you about further information of that as well. So with that, I want to wish all of the Jewish participants on this call a very happy Sukkot and happy Hoshana Rabbah, and really thank everyone, the 50 plus participants who joined us on this call, the 100 plus participants who joined us on our last call. This has been a really impactful and important series, and as Inaudi said, certainly not the last in this conversation. This conversation is only just beginning. So thank you to both of you, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.